Dead America. Tales from New York. The Bus Driver by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0. 11 p.m., the south side of Manhattan. Matthew sat behind the steering wheel of the large city bus, staring out into the darkness with heavy eyes. His long day was nearing an end, with only one more hour to go, but one long haul still remained. He reached down to his cup holder, grabbing an oversized cup of hot coffee and downing several gulps before letting out a sigh. In his youth, a jolt of caffeine would have been all he needed to push through to the end of his shift. But now, in his early 50s, he knew it would take a little more to get him across the finish line. "You better down a little more before you get moving again," Matthew muttered to himself. He glanced up at the streetlight, the red glow bathing the front windshield in crimson. He brought the cup to his lips, chugging half of what remained, letting out a cough from the heat. "You got this, man. One more hour and you'll be on your way home." Then 2 days of feet propped up and not doing a damn thing, he added, the self-motivation seeming to do the trick. The aging bus driver perked right up as the light switched to green. With a press of the pedal, the large vehicle picked up speed, crossing the intersection and heading towards the next stop a few blocks away. Matthew pulled over to the side of the road, opening the doors and motioning for the handful of passengers to come on board. The first two stepping up were Haley and Bryson, both dressed in high-end restaurant uniforms, looking just as tired as Matthew felt. The bus driver gave them a friendly nod, recognizing them as some of his regulars. "Another night through the ringer?" Matthew asked. "My bar back decided to sleep off a hangover rather than come in and do their job," Haley said, her irritation evident. "And we were short 4 on the floor tonight. My legs feel like rubber," Bryson added, rubbing his thighs. "Must be that flu that's been going around. Half the routes aren't running tonight because so many guys called out," Matthew replied. "Lucky for us, you're one of the healthy ones," Haley said with a grateful smile. "Yeah, I don't think I could walk home after that shift," Bryson said with a weary chuckle. "Well, go grab you a seat and I'll get you home in no time," Matthew assured them. The restaurant employees gave the driver a friendly nod as they made their way towards the middle of the bus. A few more passengers stepped on board, dropping their fare in the container and making their way back as Matthew focused on a notebook. The final passenger dropped his money off but didn't make his way to the seats. "Might want to find your seat so we can get moving," Matthew suggested. "Are you sure? Because I can give you a break if you need one," the man replied. Matthew's face lit up at the recognition of the voice. He looked up to spot his old friend and coworker Chris. The middle-aged man had spent the better part of a decade driving buses, only to move on to greener pastures. "Oh no, here comes trouble," Matthew said with a grin. Matthew and Chris exchanged a handshake, both men letting out a satisfied chuckle at their reunion. "What's it been? A year?" Chris asked. "That sounds about right. You kind of lose track of time when you drive the same route day in and day out," Matthew admitted. "Tell me about it. That's why I had to get out," Chris said. Before they could continue, one of the passengers in the back yelled out in an agitated manner, "Hey, can we get this show on the road? I got places to be." Chris smirked, giving the agitated man a half-hearted wave before taking the seat just off to the side of the driver. Matthew looked out at the bus stop one more time to make sure nobody else needed to board before shutting the doors. "All right, folks, we'll be at the next stop in a couple of minutes," Matthew announced. The driver hit the gas, pulling back out onto the road and continuing on. His old friend leaned forward so that they could continue their conversation. "Well, it's good to see that not much has changed since I left," Chris remarked. "About the only thing that's changed is that they finally put some money into the bus upgrade budget," Matthew replied with a chuckle. "That would be nice. I remember freezing my ass off during the winter. So how's it feel to have a modern heating and cooling system?" Chris asked. Matthew let out a belly laugh, shaking his head as he responded. "I'll let you know in 3 years when it finally gets put in." Chris joined in on the laughter, both men struggling to keep it together. Sounds like Nancy is still in charge of approving the maintenance request then. "I swear she was so tight with the money. If the bus was on fire, She would check the weather to see if it was supposed to rain before approving a fire extinguisher, Chris said, shaking his head. Yep, that describes her perfectly. But rumor has it, she's contemplating retirement, Matthew said. Yeah, but with as slow as she makes decisions, you'll be long in the ground before she files the paperwork, Chris joked. Well, a box in the ground might be warmer than this box is during the winter, Matthew replied, sending them both into another round of laughter as the bus pushed through the next intersection. Hang on just a second, Matthew said, reaching down for the microphone to the internal intercom system. 10th Street stopped coming up. 10th Street. If you are exiting, please use the rear door, he announced. The driver set the microphone back down as he pulled over to the curb. Unlike the crowd at the last stop, there was only one lone figure standing there. Matthew pulled the bus to a stop, opening the door to see a frightened young woman standing there. Her expression was blank, as if she was in shock. Miss, are you okay? Matthew asked. Chris stood up and took a step forward to get a better view. The young woman barely reacted to the driver, instead looking down at her forearm that she was clutching tightly. Both men followed her eyes down, watching as blood dripped from a wound. Oh my God, Matthew, get the med kit, Chris said, urgency in his voice. Chris walked cautiously down the steps, putting his hands up and slowing down as he realized the woman was terrified. It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you, he assured her. The young woman backpedaled for a moment before finally stopping. She gave the older man a nod, letting him know it was safe for him to approach. My name's Chris. Can you tell me what happened? He asked gently. The young woman continued staring at him in shock, unable to speak. After a few moments, both of their attentions were drawn towards the rear of the bus as moans and heavy footsteps filled the air. Oh my God, they're here, the woman whispered, panic overtaking her face. Who is here? Chris asked, turning to look back towards the next block. He saw a handful of figures sprinting towards them. As he turned back towards the young woman, she fled, running as hard as she could in the other direction. Wait, we can help you, Chris called out, but she disappeared into the darkness. It didn't take long for him to snap his head back around to the mob that was rapidly approaching the rear of the bus, their moans filling him with a sense of dread. Where did she go? Matthew asked, standing in the doorway of the bus, holding the med kit and looking around for the young woman. Once he realized that Chris was staring at something behind them, he looked back himself. Man, they really want to catch the bus, Matthew said, trying to lighten the mood. Something's not right, Chris muttered. Are you sure? Matthew asked, concern creeping into his voice. Get back on the bus and shut the doors, Chris ordered. Matthew could hear the hint of panic and concern in his friend's voice, pushing him to retreat back to his seat. Chris remained fixated on the people running towards them, confused as they blindly ran into the side street without so much as a look. Are you coming or not? Matthew called out. Damn it, I'm on, Chris said, darting onto the bus and rushing up the stairs while trying to get a look out of the back windows. Matthew hit the switch to shut the doors, which took a moment to begin moving. Before the rear door could shut, however, one of the passengers let out a horrific scream. Oh my God, a passenger cried. Chris and Matthew turned to see a crazed man darting onto the bus, making a beeline for a young man who was sitting just across from the door. They watched in horror as the man lunged for the passenger, slamming his head into the window before biting into the nape of his neck. Jesus Christ. Get us out of here, Chris shouted. Matthew hit the gas as Chris rushed towards the back of the bus. The other passengers screamed in terror as they watched the ghoul rip out the throat of the unfortunate man. Everyone did their best to put distance between themselves and the attacker, but there was only so much room to move. Chris rushed towards the ghoul without fear or hesitation, grabbing onto the back of his shirt and pulling him off the young man. The zombie thrashed about wildly, flailing his arms in an attempt to grab onto any living person within reach. Chris looked over to Bryson, who had positioned himself between the creature and Haley. The older man spoke forcefully and only to the waiter. When I tell you to, I want you to hit that emergency release button next to the door. Move there, now. Despite his fear, Bryson obeyed the instruction, getting into position as Chris struggled to control the creature. Let me know when you want me to stop. Matthew called out. Screw this guy. Keep driving, Chris replied. Like Bryson, Matthew obeyed his friend's order, keeping the pedal down and the bus moving as Chris got into position. The creature continued flailing about, trying to reach the man who had it by the collar and belt, but not doing anything to prevent itself from being pushed towards the door. Hit it now, Chris commanded. Bryson reached over, smacking the emergency release button. A split second later, the doors opened up, allowing the cool night air to fill the bus. This is your stop, asshole, Chris shouted, planting his feet firmly before shoving the ghoul forward with every bit of force he could muster. The creature flew headfirst out of the bus, landing hard on the pavement before rolling to a stop. Bryson hit the release button again to close the door. Are you good, man? Bryson asked. Yeah, I'm fine, Chris replied, breathing heavily. But this guy isn't, Haley exclaimed. Chris and Bryson turned around to spot Haley standing a few feet away from the injured passenger as another man did his best to treat the bite. My God, that man took a chunk out of him. Bit into his neck like it was a cheeseburger, the passenger said, his voice trembling. Can you stop the bleeding? Chris asked. We're going to find out, the passenger replied grimly. The passenger stood up tall, ripping off his sweater and using it as a makeshift bandage. He pressed hard on the wound, looking the injured man in the eyes in an attempt to get him to focus. You need to stay with me, man. Keep your eyes on me and you're going to be okay, he said firmly. Chris moved quickly towards the front of the bus, where Matthew continued driving through the darkened streets. How is he? Matthew asked, glancing at his friend through the rearview mirror. It's not good, man. We need to get him to a doctor, Chris said, urgency lacing his tone. Matthew nodded and picked up his radio, clicking it on and speaking rapidly. Dispatch, do you copy? This is bus 116, and I have a medical incident on board. Matthew let go of the radio button, listening for a reply, receiving only static in return. Dispatch, do you copy? He repeated. Silence continued to be the only reply, causing Matthew to give his longtime friend a worrying look. Well, that can't be good. Chapter 2. Matthew continued driving the bus of stunned passengers down the Manhattan street. Instead of being on autopilot like he normally was for this run, the driver had his eyes focused on everything moving on the sidewalk. Chris, I need you to call 911, Matthew said. I'm on it, Chris replied. Chris pulled his cell from his pocket, quickly punching in the numbers and hitting call. Rather than hear the normal ringing, a high-pitched squeal came through the receiver. Chris yanked the phone away from his ear at the unexpected sound. Let's try that again, Chris muttered. He hit redial, keeping the phone away from his ear as the same unusual sound pierced the air. He defeatedly hit end call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Nobody's home at emergency services, Chris said. Jesus, so what the hell do we do? Matthew asked. Chris thought about it for a moment before blurting out a potential answer. Spring Hill Med Center is only 6 blocks from here. I don't see any other way, Matthew replied. Matthew reached down and grabbed the internal microphone, clicking it on and speaking with as much confidence as he could muster. Okay, everybody, we're taking a bit of a detour to the hospital a few blocks away. I don't know what's going on, but it's not good. How's our patient doing back there? He's still with us, but the blood loss is. Haley trailed off as the dread bubbled up within her. Bryson stepped up to finish the thought. Just get us there quick, Matthew. Hang on, because we're going to break a few traffic laws, Matthew said. The driver dropped the microphone to his side, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he spun it hard to the right. The tires squealed as they took the next corner sharply. Once they were straight again, Matthew pushed the gas pedal down to the floor, silently praying to himself that the lights ahead of them stayed green. Chris took a knee beside his old friend, trying his best to remain calm. Are you doing all right, buddy? I'm starting to regret not catching that flu that's going around. But other than that, I'm doing okay, Matthew said. Chris let out a chuckle, giving his friend a pat on the back as he got back to his feet. He walked towards the rear of the bus, where the other passengers were still tending to the injured man. "Don't worry, we're going to be at the hospital soon," Chris said. Chris looked down at the man who was barely clinging to life. Despite knocking on death's door, he gave a half-hearted thumbs up. Haley grabbed onto Chris, pulling him towards the front of the bus so that they could talk out of earshot of the others. "Is everything okay?" Chris asked. Despite that thumbs up, he's not in great shape. "That bite is nasty. And really, who the hell does that to another person?" Haley said. "I know, that asshole was out of his mind. He must have been on something powerful if he's biting people and willing to take a header out of a moving bus. I mean, did you see that when I was shoving him out?" "He didn't even try to stop me," Chris replied. "I would say that doesn't make sense, but I've bartended long enough to know people aren't in their right mind when they've had a few too many," Haley said. "Yeah, fair enough, but something was definitely more wrong than normal with him," Chris said. Both Haley and Chris staggered to their right, barely hanging onto their balance as the bus swerved unexpectedly. A moment later, the vehicle bounced several times, as if it ran over something big. "What in the hell is going on up there?" Chris shouted. Matthew didn't answer, clearly focused on the road ahead of him. Both Chris and Haley walked up to the front of the bus, making sure to keep firm grips on the seats as they went in case of another unexpected swerve. "Matthew, what the hell was that?" Chris asked. The driver had a stunned expression on his face as he hit the windshield wipers. The squeaking on the glass prompted the two passengers to look ahead, watching the wipers smudge blood on the glass. "Is that what I think it is?" Haley asked. "I tried to avoid them, I really did. But they just ran straight for us," Matthew said. "Who did?" Chris asked. "I don't know, but they looked like they were crazy like our biter back there. No sense of self-preservation, just running right into the front of the bus," Matthew said. "If they were like the biter back there, I think we're lucky that the bus won," Chris said. "The hospital is just up on the next block. You should get our friend back there ready to move," Matthew said. "Those two back there can handle it. As soon as we stop, I'll run inside and..." Chris was cut off as he was flung forward by the sudden stopping of the bus. Matthew pushed both feet into the brakes as hard as he could, bringing the speeding vehicle to a screeching halt. "What the hell, man?" Chris shouted. "Look," Matthew said. Matthew and Haley looked down on the next block to where the hospital was, both of them gasping as the scene came into focus. Dozens of creatures ran rampant in the street, some chasing other people, while several groups fed on victims laying on the ground. 2 ambulances stood empty and abandoned just off to the side of the emergency room entrance. Despite being a block away, all 3 of them could see blood splatter inside the back of one of the ambulances. "Jesus Christ," Chris said. "What do we do now?" "That man in the back needs medical attention," Haley said. "He might need it, but I don't think he's going to get it. At least not here," Chris said. "There's got to be another hospital," Haley said. "Not for 20 or 30 blocks, and who's to say that it isn't going to be the same scene playing out there?" Matthew replied. "We have to at least try," Haley said. "I don't think we can." "Haley," Matthew said. "But we." Matthew cut off the young bartender with a forceful response. "We're going to do what we can, but there's no way we're going to be able to make it 20 blocks if the streets are anything like what we just went through." "Yeah, we had some people who were desperate to catch the bus, but it wasn't that bad, was it?" Chris asked. "For every one of those people who I ran over, there were 5 on the sidewalk," Matthew said. "So what are we supposed to do? I live on a 5th floor walk-up and don't really want to try and ride this thing out there," Haley said. "Yeah, my place ain't much better," Matthew said. "I think we need to get off the island," Chris said. "And go where?" Haley asked. "Jersey?" Chris suggested. "You want me to steal a city bus and take it out of state?" Matthew asked. Chris pointed out the window towards the chaos that had enveloped the hospital. "I tell you what, let's start driving to the bridge. If we see more stuff like this, we keep driving. If it's just an isolated thing here, then we won't have anything to worry about." Matthew contemplated for a few moments before nodding his head in agreement. Okay, we'll head towards Jersey. While I drive, I want you and everybody else who isn't actively preventing our friend back there from bleeding to death to keep calling 911. Chris, can you take care of that? I'm going to reach out to a few of my industry friends I know are working tonight. I figure they might know something, but even if they don't, I feel like someone should give them a heads up that something bad is happening out here, Haley said. That sounds good. See if you can get your waiter friend to do the same. The more info we have, the better, Chris replied. Haley nodded and retreated to the back of the bus to start calling. Chris held his hand over his phone, hesitant to hit dial again. After a long pause, he hit the call button, letting out a sigh as the same high-pitched noise came out through the receiver. Still the same story, Chris said. Might as well keep trying. Unless you know anybody else who is up at this hour, Matthew said. Yeah, I'll go through my contacts and see who's a night owl, Chris replied. Matthew nodded as Chris took the seat behind him to make the calls. The road ahead was clear, however. The driver could see flashing lights up a few blocks. A taxi cab sat on the sidewalk, the front end smashed up against a streetlight. Chris, we have a problem, Matthew said. What is it? Chris asked. Chris got up and rushed to the front of the bus, looking out at the situation. The wrecked taxi wasn't the only thing on the street, as half a dozen zombies swarmed the driver's side. The creatures were pressed up against the windows, slamming their hands on the glass. Is someone in there? Chris asked. Maybe, but I don't really want to get out and find out, Matthew said. There might be another way to help them, Chris said. If you want to get out and help, I'm dropping you off a block up, Matthew replied. Chris let out a chuckle, shaking his head before continuing. You said those people ran right at the bus, right? Like they were attracted to it. Yeah, I don't know if they liked the noise or the light, but they ran right at me, Matthew said. Okay, when we get a block up, I want you to lay on the horn, Chris said. You want me to do what? Matthew asked. Lay on the horn, let them know that we're here. They're not getting through the front end of the bus, so we'll push right through them if they don't get out of the way. And whoever is stuck inside will have a chance to make a run for it, Chris explained. I've heard worse ideas. Let's do it, Matthew said. Matthew pulled the bus up to the next intersection, slowing to a crawl before laying on the horn. The deep blast of sound echoed throughout the city streets, and within seconds drew the attention of every zombie that was pressed up against the taxi. The ghouls let out excited moans as they raced towards the bus, every single one of them ignoring the occupants of the taxi in favor of the shiny new object. Hang on, here we go, Matthew shouted. Matthew hit the gas and the bus lurched forward, quickly gaining traction and picking up speed. The ghouls continued racing straight for the front of the bus, with no signs of getting out of the way. Matthew gripped the wheel tightly, not wanting to lose control when the impact happened. Chris, meanwhile, kept his attention focused on the taxi, watching as a lone woman threw open the back door. Rather than run for safety, she stood on the side of the road waving her hands frantically. Jesus, I think she wants us to pick her up, Chris said. I'm sure as hell not stopping this thing, Matthew replied. Just open the door and slow down when we get close, Chris said. Matthew nodded and hit the front door switch, swinging it wide open. Chris made his way down the stairs, gripping onto the railing with one hand and leaving his other free to reach out. Hang on, Matthew shouted. The entire bus bounced as the creatures smacked off the front end, a couple of them being pulled underneath. Once he was confident that he wasn't going to be hit by flying zombie parts, Chris stuck his head out into the open, yelling as loud as he could. Start running and I'll grab you, Chris yelled. The young woman nodded and did as instructed, running up the street in the same direction the bus was traveling. Slow down and I'll get her, Chris said. Matthew nodded, letting off the gas once he ran over the last remaining ghoul on the street. The bus pulled alongside the young woman, who looked over and matched her speed. With a leap, Chris grabbed onto her arm, pulling her into the relative safety of the bus. The two of them stumbled a bit, falling backwards onto the floor, the young woman landing on top of the older man. She struggled to grab her breath, as Chris let out a sly grin. I'm Chris, and welcome aboard, Chris said. I'm Lisa. And if you give me just a moment, I'll get off of you, Lisa replied. Take your time, my dear. I'm in no hurry, Chris said. Matthew glanced down to his friend with a playfully disgusted look, prompting Chris to let out a laugh. What, if you had a beautiful woman laying on top of you, then you wouldn't be in a hurry either, Chris said. Lisa shook her head, planting her hands into his chest and forcefully pushing herself upright. I appreciate the help there, but I'm sorry you're not my type, Lisa said. I'm too old for you? Chris asked. Too young, Lisa said. Lisa looked over to Matthew, giving him a playful wink, somehow knowing that it would eat at her rescuer. Matthew let out a hearty laugh, smacking his friend on the shoulder. Oh, buddy, I like her. Chapter 3. Matthew kept the bus rolling down the streets to the west towards the bridge over to New Jersey. Despite the number of creatures running amok outside, he kept the vehicle moving at a brisk pace, knowing that every second counted. Chris turned to Lisa. So Lisa, how did you find yourself in the back of a taxi cab surrounded by whatever those people are? Lisa shook her head, the memory still vivid. I wish I could tell you. 1 minute I'm looking at my phone while the driver is cruising down the street. Next thing I know, he's yelling out and swerving. We hit hard, and by the time I got my wits about me, those people were banging on the window. Matthew glanced at her through the rearview mirror. What about the driver? Did he make it out? Lisa fell silent for a moment, struggling to form the words. He was angry, so he jumped out of the car and started yelling at those people. 1 second he's flipping them off, the next he's on his back yelling out as they bit into him. Chris exhaled sharply. Jesus. Lisa's voice trembled. I've never seen anything like it. Chris nodded grimly. Neither had we until tonight. One of those people got onto the bus and took a bite out of one of the passengers in the back. Lisa's face went white with terror, confusing Chris. Don't worry, he assured her. I threw him off the bus. Lisa's voice was sharp. You got the bitten person off the bus? Chris stammered for a moment, confused by the question. No, I mean I threw the biter off the bus. Why would I throw the bitten person off? Lisa's expression turned grave. Those bites, they do something. Chris frowned. What are you talking about? Matthew's voice broke in, calm but firm. It's what causes people to go crazy, isn't it? Chris turned to him, disbelief etched across his face. What the hell? Are you serious? Matthew's gaze didn't waver. Chris, think about it. Did you see a body on the ground when we drove up to the taxi? Chris thought about it for a moment, the realization slowly dawning on him. Jesus. Chris turned towards the rear of the bus, moving quickly while yelling out, Everybody, I need you to move away from the injured man. Bryson shot him a questioning look. Dude, what are you talking about? He's barely clinging to life. Chris didn't waver. All the more reason to back up. Bryson took offense to the suggestion, pushing past Haley and getting in Chris's way to prevent him from getting close to the injured man. You're out of your damn mind. Chris's tone grew more urgent. Listen to me. Those bites do something to the people who are bitten. Bryson glared at him. How in the hell do you know that? Chris gestured towards Lisa. We pieced it together with the help of the new girl. Now I need everybody to move away from this guy. Bryson glanced past Chris, spotting Lisa, who was silently nodding, trying to convey the truth of Chris's words. Before Bryson could respond, Haley let out a yelp from just behind them. Bryson's head snapped around. Haley, are you okay? Haley's voice was shaky. I think he just passed away. Chris went into panic mode, trying to push through Bryson to get to the passenger tending to the wounded man. Let me through, man, let me through. Finally, Bryson stepped aside, allowing Chris to reach the deceased man. Chris grabbed onto the shoulder of the passenger kneeling beside the body, gently pulling on him, but the man wouldn't budge. Chris's voice rose. You need to move, you need to move. The man brushed off Chris's concerns, staying in place with his eyes closed, giving a prayer for the dying man. Chris grabbed his shoulder again, prompting the passenger to smack his hand away forcefully. Several tense moments passed as he finished his prayer. When he finally turned around, he spoke angrily. "Don't you ever touch me again, especially when I'm saying a prayer for the fallen. Do you understand me?" Chris nodded quickly. Yeah, whatever. You have to move now." The passenger glared at him. "I'll move when I'm damn good and ready to." Haley's scream cut him off. The man turned to see that the corpse of the passenger he had been helping was upright again. "What the hell?" he whispered. The zombified passenger let out a horrific sound before lurching forward and grabbing onto the stunned man. The impact sent the larger man tumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and falling to the ground. The ghoul managed to grab onto his shirt, going along for the ride to the floor of the bus. Before the man could scream, the creature latched onto his shoulder with its teeth, pulling out a sizable chunk of flesh. Blood spurted from his wound, coating the seats and nearby passengers. Bryson shouted in alarm. "Holy shit." He grabbed Haley and dragged her towards the front of the bus, leaving Chris to deal with the carnage alone. Rather than run, Chris stared down at the creature as it went in for another bite on the passenger. Its teeth dug into the man's throat, ripping it out with a forceful bite. Chris turned towards the front of the bus where everyone else stood in fear. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a broom tucked away beside the first seat. Without a second thought, he broke from his position, rushing towards the cleaning instrument. Chris grabbed the broom, shoving the bristles into the floor of the bus and giving the base a swift kick. The cleaning portion of the broom broke free with a single strike, leaving a long wooden stake behind. Lisa called out, "Chris, look out." Chris looked up to see the zombified passenger running up the aisle towards the front of the bus. He quickly lifted the makeshift weapon, putting the blunt end against his stomach for extra support. A second later, the sprinting creature slammed into the jagged edge with enough force to fully impale itself. Rather than cry out in pain, the creature continued driving its feet forward, pushing its torso through the broken broom handle. "What the fuck is this?" Chris shouted, struggling to keep the creature at bay. Bryson rushed to his side, slamming up against Chris's back to steady him. "I got you, man." Bryson reached around Chris, grabbing onto the broom and helping him drive the zombie back. They only managed a step before the other creature was back on its feet and keenly interested in them. Chris yelled out, "Brace for impact." Both passengers stood their ground as the freshly reanimated creature ran towards them, meeting the same fate as the first one. The jagged tip of the broom hit the ghoul center mass, driving deep into its torso. The foursome stood their ground in the middle of the bus, each side trying to force the other back. Despite the stalemate, Chris and Bryson's muscles began to burn from the exertion. "What are we going to do, man?" Bryson panted. Chris thought about it for a moment before yelling out, "Matthew, let off the gas right now, but don't hit the brakes." Matthew's voice came through immediately, letting off the gas. Chris felt the bus begin to lose speed, though not dramatically. "When I tell you to, I want you to punch it." "Ready when you are," Matthew replied. Chris turned to Bryson. "Okay, man, when he punches it, the momentum is going to be on our side, and we need to drive them back to the door." Bryson frowned. "That's a terrible idea." Chris smirked grimly. "Yeah, I know, but it's the only one I got. Matthew, punch it." The driver put the pedal to the metal, lurching the bus forward and sending everyone inside forcefully towards the rear. The sudden shift in momentum caused the two creatures to stumble backward, tripping over their feet and falling to the ground with enough force to rip the broomstick from the passenger's hands. One zombie landed on top of the other, still connected with the splintered handle. Both of them thrashed about on the ground, giving Chris the opportunity to leap up onto a seat before jumping onto the top one's chest. He grabbed onto the broom handle for stability while driving his boot into the creature's throat. Bryson yelled out, "What the hell do we do now?" Chris glanced back. "I'm open to suggestions." Lisa called out, "Hey, big guy." Bryson turned to see Lisa reaching into her small purse. A moment later, she tossed a folding knife to him. He opened it, staring at it incredulously. "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" Lisa's voice was sharp. Stab them with it. Bryson shook his head. They already have a broomstick through the chest. What the hell is this going to do? Lisa snapped. I don't know. Try going for the head. Bryson glanced at Chris, who was bouncing around like a rodeo cowboy. Get over here and do it, Chris shouted. Bryson nodded and climbed over the seats to get to the other side of the mass of flesh on the floor. He took a knee beside the creature's heads, pausing to ensure his aim was right. Chris yelled again. Jesus Christ, man, do it already. Bryson let out a yell as he drove the tip of the knife into the eye socket of the top zombie. The blade dug into the creature's brain, snapping the life out of it like flicking a light switch. Both Bryson and Chris stared at the downed ghoul before exchanging a glance and a shrug. Chris grinned faintly. Hell yeah, man. Can you get to the other one? Bryson yanked the blade free before lining up another shot. While he couldn't see the ghoul's eyes, its ears were an easy target. Without hesitation, he shoved the knife into the ear canal and slammed his palm into the back end. The zombie convulsed for a moment before falling silent. Even with the presumed demise of the creatures, Chris kept his full weight on them, not wanting to take any chances. Are we good? Chris asked breathlessly. Bryson nodded. Yeah, I think we're good. Chris collapsed onto a seat, letting out a sigh of relief. I never want to do that again. Bryson chuckled weakly. You and me both, man. You and me both. Chapter 4. Bryson stepped over the corpses on the ground, extending a hand to Chris to help him back to his feet. As they made their way to the front of the bus, they felt it decelerating. Chris turned to Matthew. Matthew, what's going on? Matthew's face was tense. I think you need to see for yourself. Chris and Bryson stepped to the front of the bus, letting out a sigh as they saw what was before them. Well, I guess Jersey is out, Chris muttered. The bridge was just a couple of blocks away, and it was complete gridlock. Not only was traffic not moving, but figures were moving in between the cars. They were too far away to get a clean look, but it was obvious that the bridge was overrun by zombies. So what do we do now? Haley asked, her voice trembling. Bryson shrugged. Going home and locking the doors up tight sounds like a good plan to me. Haley shook her head. I've seen your place. I don't think we'd all fit. Bryson smirked. Well, I wasn't exactly inviting everyone. Lisa crossed her arms. I live in Jersey, so if this is the plan, I guess I'm swimming across. Don't worry, wherever we go, you can come with us, Haley reassured her. Lisa's expression softened. It still doesn't answer the question of where we're going. Bryson turned to Chris. You're being awfully quiet there. What you got cooking up? Chris glanced at Matthew. You tried dispatch, right? Yeah, and nobody was home, Matthew confirmed. So the bus depot is probably overrun? Chris asked. Matthew nodded. Place is too big anyway. We'd never get it secured. Chris sighed. Yeah, those things are tough to put down. We know what to do, but it's a chore to do it. Lisa interjected. Wherever we go, we need to make sure there's plenty of food and water. Bryson raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? Lisa gestured towards the bridge. Just look out there. Those people are everywhere, and if somebody gets bitten, they get right back up and join them. We have to assume this isn't something that's going to get solved overnight. She's right, Matthew agreed. And there's no food at the depot, even if we could get there. Chris thought about it for a moment before a grin spread across his face. Start heading north. I know where we can go. Matthew's brow furrowed. Where? There's a grocery store up on 15th that the company I work for is renovating. It's been closed for the last few days. If we can get in there, we'll have plenty of food, Chris explained. That works for me. Any objections? Matthew asked, looking around at the others. None of them spoke up against the plan. All right, everybody take your seats because this might be a bumpy ride, Matthew instructed. The passengers moved quickly to the seats closest to the front of the bus, taking their positions as Matthew made the turn to the north and hit the gas. They picked up speed quickly, racing down the darkened streets. "Chris, you're going to have to let me know where I'm going," Matthew called out. Chris pulled out his phone. "Just keep moving north and I'll let you know when to turn. I'm pulling up the directions on my..." Chris was interrupted by a violent collision that sent the back end of the bus skidding across the street. Matthew tried his best to keep the vehicle on the road, but physics had other ideas. The back wheels hit the curb with enough velocity to send the bus tipping over, teetering on edge for a moment before falling. "Hang on," Matthew shouted. Every passenger grabbed onto the seat in front of them as tightly as they could as the bus crashed onto its side. Haley and Bryson's grips failed them, causing the duo to fall to the seats that were now below them. Haley let out a scream as her legs snapped against the rigid plastic seat. Bryson had a somewhat softer landing, inadvertently using Chris to break his fall. Both men let out pained huffs as the younger man fell onto the other. Matthew pulled himself up from the driver's seat, which was now against the sidewalk. "Is everybody still with me?" He looked back to the others, who were struggling to get themselves up. The driver stepped carefully, reaching down to help Lisa to her feet. "I'm okay. Go help that other girl," Lisa said. Matthew pushed deeper into the back of the bus, spotting Haley laying in an awkward position on the sides of the seats. He reached down to help her up but stopped when he saw the condition of her leg, which was sitting at an unnatural angle. "Oh my God, Haley, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It's broken. My leg is broken," she cried out. It's okay. We'll figure something out," Matthew said, trying to reassure her. "Need a little help here," Chris called out. Matthew looked over to spot his friend, who struggled to push Bryson off of him. The driver stepped onto a nearby seat to lend a hand. "I got you, Bryson. Just grab my hand," Matthew instructed. Bryson nodded and did as instructed, eventually getting to his feet before turning and helping Chris up. "What the hell happened, man?" Bryson asked. Matthew shook his head. "I didn't get a good look at it, but I think a car ran the light and clipped us." Chris winced. "If it knocked us on our side, it did more than clip us." "Forget the semantics. We have to get the hell out of here," Bryson urged. Lisa pointed over to Haley. "There's no way we're going to be able to lift her up to reach the door. There's an emergency roof hatch about halfway back. We can get out that way," Matthew said, already moving. As he made his way towards the back of the bus, the sound of hands smacking against the exposed undercarriage of the bus froze him in his tracks. Everyone fell silent, which was soon filled with moaning to go along with the banging. Bryson's eyes widened. "My God. Those people are here." Chris took a deep breath. "We can handle them. We just have to get out of here." Lisa's voice was filled with doubt. "And go where?" Chris shrugged. "I don't even know where we are, but if I see an open door, I'm going through it." Lisa leapt into action, balancing herself on the seats to move to the front of the bus, making sure to stay as out of sight as she could while looking out. There were a handful of creatures running around the street who were chasing other noises and paying them no attention. Most of the buildings on the street were dark, offices that were closed for the day and unlikely to ever open again. The only signs of life came from across the next intersection 50 yards away, a small bar built into a high rise. The lights were on, but she watched in dismay as a creature staggered out of the front door before running off into the night. "Well, I got good news and bad news," Lisa said. Chris groaned. "Just spring it on us. How screwed are we?" "There's a bar at the next intersection with an open door, but I just saw one of those people coming out from it," Lisa explained. "How far away is it?" Chris asked. "Half a block at least," Lisa replied. Chris shook his head. "Jesus, there's no way we're going to be able to get Haley up there with those people running around." Bryson stepped forward. "Don't you worry about that. I'll carry her." "Bryson, just leave me." "If you try and carry me, we'll both die," Haley protested. Bryson's tone was firm. "Haley, this is happening. I'm going to carry you, and we're going to be okay. Don't fight me on this." Haley's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. She doubted his ability to pull it off but didn't want to die alone in the bus. Matthew spoke up. "Okay, we're going to the bar. Let's get back to the hatch." It took the passengers several minutes to navigate the overturned bus, taking up a position by the emergency escape. Chris brought up the rear, leaning down in between the seats and yanking what was left of the broken broom handle free from the two ghouls. "Let me take the point. I'll do what I can to clear the path," Chris offered. Matthew nodded and waited for his friend to push his way to the front of the group. "I'll see you on the other side, my friend." Chris gripped a makeshift weapon tightly, waiting for Matthew to pop open the escape. Despite the driver's best effort, the heavy hatch slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground. "Damn it," Matthew muttered. Chris leapt out of the bus, looking back for threats, relieved to see that the rear of the vehicle was resting against the side of a building, preventing anyone from getting through. He inched his way to the front, hoping that the route remained clear. It took a solid minute for everyone to climb out, the group lining up behind their leader at the front of the bus. Lisa put her hand on Chris's back as she leaned out, pointing towards the bar. With a subtle nod, Chris let the others know it was time to move. He led them out from cover at a brisk pace, everyone pumping their legs as hard as they could towards their alcohol-infused oasis at the next intersection. The group managed to get 10 yards away from the bus before hearing footsteps trailing them. Matthew glanced back at Bryson and Haley, who weren't keeping pace with the group. Just behind them were half a dozen zombies, rushing towards them at an alarmingly fast pace. "You gotta run, man," Matthew shouted. Bryson strained under the weight of Haley, who was on his back. He tried his best to outrun the ghouls, but it wasn't long before they caught up to them. Matthew watched helplessly as the first zombie grabbed onto Haley's shirt, slowing the duo down enough so that another creature could tackle them. Matthew's first thought was to go back and help, but his survival instincts kicked in and kept him moving. The pained screams from the two instilled a primal fear into him, keeping his legs pumping hard. Chris led the now trio towards the intersection, his footfalls on the pavement drawing the attention of a creature out front of the bar. The ghoul let out a moan before racing towards him. Chris got the broomstick in attack position, using it like a lance during a joust. He aimed it just right, piercing it through the chest of the lead creature. The impact and subsequent shove was enough to send the creature stumbling off balance, falling to the pavement and allowing the survivors to race past it. Excited moans filled the air from either side of the intersection as the trio raced across the street. A dozen creatures spotted them and raced in their direction, quickly closing the gap. "Get to the door," Matthew shouted. Chris ignored the threats bearing down on them, focused entirely on the front door of the bar. He plowed through it, stepping out of the way so that Lisa could clear the threshold. Matthew, however, lagged behind them by a few steps, allowing the front edge of the mob to catch him. Matthew's eyes locked onto his friends, the two men sharing a pained moment as Chris watched the driver vanish under a swarm of creatures. He continued staring at the ghouls feasting on his friend until Lisa shoved him out of the way and secured the door. Both of them stood at the entrance, panting and in shock from their doomed run. Lisa knew Chris was in pain, struggling to find the words to comfort him. Before she could open her mouth, a disturbing banging sound resonated from the rear of the bar. Both Chris and Lisa perked up, a sense of dread filling them. The two of them looked at each other, silently asking one another what to do. Chris looked to the side, grabbing a beer bottle. In a bar fight, it would have been a useful makeshift weapon, but in this situation, it was like a band-aid on a bullet wound. The two of them walked carefully through the devastated bar towards the source of the noise. Several tables were overturned, broken glass and blood mingling on the ground. As they got closer to the back hallway, moans could be heard in between the banging. Chris and Lisa inched forward, moving into position at the top of the hallway. Their hearts dropped when they saw a dozen creatures pressed up against a door barely 5 yards away from them. Before either of them could move, one of the ghouls looked back and spotted them. The creature paused for a moment, as if it couldn't believe its eyes. Chris and Lisa stared back at it in similar disbelief. "I'm sorry, Lisa," Chris whispered. The zombie let out a moan before sprinting towards the duo, who stood motionless, as if they had accepted their fate. Within seconds, the rest of the horde broke away from the door, racing to join their comrade in a fresh meal. The end.